On a frosty January morning in 1855, the people of Callaway County, Missouri, awoke to the acrid smell of burning wood. But that wasn't the worst of it. The cold breath of death wafted across the quiet fields. When they reached the charred remains of the Newsom barn, what they saw would become one of the most gruesome and deliberately buried cases in American legal history. Behind the blackened timbers was the charred body of Robert Newsom, a respected landowner who had been burned to the point that only his gold watch and wedding ring remained to identify him. But this was no accident, and it was no random act of violence. This was the result of 5 years of brutality endured by a 19-year-old slave girl named Celia, an act so horrific that it took Missouri courts months to decide whether she had the right to self-defense. What happened in that barn was more than just a murder. It was a trial that exposed the darkest contradictions in American society. At the time, a story so profound that local officials buried all records of it. Before we continue following Celia and the fateful night that changed everything, I want you to do me a favor. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me which state you're listening from. Because this story reveals historical truths that every corner of America should know. The events that follow were recorded in court records, newspaper articles from the time, and witness testimony, which are still preserved in the Missouri State Archives, though many suspect that some important documents mysteriously disappeared in the decades that followed. Callaway County in 1850 was a prosperous rural region along the Missouri River, where tobacco and hemp plantations spread across rolling hills, dotted with small farmhouses and stately mansions. This was the heart of what became known as Little Dixie, a region where Southern plantation culture was deeply rooted with slavery feeding the economy. Nearly 40% of the population lived in slavery, working the fields and serving as servants for families who had migrated from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee in search of cheaper land and better opportunities. Robert Newsom was the kind of man who thrived in this environment. At 60, he owned a large farm 6 miles south of Fulton with a 2-story white house, several outbuildings, and 60 acres of rich farmland. Neighbors respected him as a hard-working widower who raised 2 daughters, Virginia and Mary, after his wife died in 1849. The farm produced enough tobacco and corn to sustain a comfortable life, and he owned 5 slaves who did most of the manual labor. What set Newsom apart was not wealth, but sheer power. Neighbors later testified that his farm was run like an army, and that his slaves moved with perfect efficiency, knowing the consequences of disappointing their masters. He was a regular member of the local Methodist Church, donating generously to missionary work, though many noted that he often attended church alone, leaving his family behind on the farm. In June 1850, Newsom made a fateful transaction that would both seal his own fate and change the life of a 14-year-old girl whose name would echo through Missouri's legal system for decades to come. In the Ordon County Courthouse, he paid 800 gold pieces for Celia, described in the receipt as a healthy, fertile Negro girl. The seller William Grayson had owned Celia since birth, but financial difficulties forced him to sell her human property. Court records show that Grayson advertised Celia as suitable for domestic work and childbearing, a term with a chilling connotation in the slave markets of the pre-Civil War South. The journey from Grayson's farm to Newsom was less than 50 miles, but it was Celia's gateway to a hell that would last 5 years. She was tall for her age, with intelligent eyes and a quiet demeanor, as if she had been raised beyond her destiny as a slave. Those who lived with her later said that Celia could read simple letters and do basic math skills that were rare and actually forbidden to slaves in Missouri. The Newsom farm where Celia arrived that summer was a world unto itself. It was remote enough that screams could not be heard from the neighbors, but close enough to town that Robert remained a respected pillar of the community. The main house sat on a knoll overlooking the slave quarters, a simple log cabin with a dirt floor and no windows. Behind it was the barn that would become the scene of the most grisly murder in Callaway County history. It was a sturdy structure built of local lumber, with walls so thick they muffled sound, with a loft for winter food. From the moment Celia stepped foot on the farm, neighbors would later testify that the atmosphere at Newsom seemed different. The remaining slaves, Ben a man in his 30s, Coffee, a middle-aged woman, Patty, Coffee's teenage daughter, and Joe, only 10 years old, moving with attention beyond the fatigue of a slave. When questioned years later in court, they acknowledged that Nome had warned, "Don't get involved with the new girl." But no one could have imagined that the 14-year-old would become the centerpiece of a legal case that would expose fundamental contradictions in American justice, forcing Missouri courts to confront questions they had avoided for decades. Does a slave have the right to defend herself against rape? Does property have the right to fight against its master? When the law protecting white male power collides with the pretense of Christian morality, what happens? The assault began on Celia's first night in Newsom and continued methodically for 5 years. What we know about those early months comes from Celia's own testimony, which later had the court recorder's hand shaking as he transcribed each word. She recounted, "He told me to come up when he called. I wasn't just bought to work in the fields. I'll soon see what that means." The pattern was repeated during the day. Newsom maintained the facade of a respectable Christian farmer working in the fields, running errands in town, maintaining amiable relations with his neighbors. But at night, when his daughters were in bed and the other slaves were told to stay in their tents, he called Celia up to the house. The physical evidence of the attacks gradually accumulated. Celia gave birth to her first child in 1852 when she was only 16. Although Newsom's daughters Virginia and Mary later claimed to have no knowledge of their father's nocturnal activities, neighbors testified that it was impossible not to notice a pregnancy taking place in their home. The child bore a striking resemblance to Robert Newsom from his pale blue eyes to his prominent chin. Even more horrifying were the methods Newsom used to ensure Celia's obedience and silence. Other slaves testified that he kept detailed records of everyone's behavior in a leather notebook from minor to imaginary offenses, turning it into a tool of psychological torture. One wrong word, one sympathetic gesture, and the punishment would not stop at Celia, but anyone who dared to help her. Ben, the oldest slave, later said that Nuoma bluntly warned, "What happens in this house after dark is my business. Anyone who gets involved will be sold farther down the river, faster than they can say goodbye." In the Missouri context, this threat was particularly terrifying. Being sold far away meant being sent to the brutal sugar and cotton plantations of Louisiana or Mississippi, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. The isolation of the Newsom farm was a key factor in allowing these crimes to take place. The nearest neighbor, lived half a mile away, too far away to hear any sounds from the house or the slave quarters. The layout of the farm seemed to have been deliberately designed to provide privacy. The slave cabin was hidden behind a grove of oak trees, hidden from view from the road, while the main house was positioned so that Robert Newsom could easily observe anyone approaching his property. By 1853, Celia had given birth to a second child, a girl who also bore the unmistakable features of her master. The local Methodist minister, Reverend John Hammond, later testified that he had noticed Newsom's extraordinary contentment during this period, describing him as someone who found unusual joy in his family. When pressed for details, Hammond admitted that he found it odd that Newsom made no mention of finding a new wife, despite being a relatively young widow, and appeared content with the state of his family. What made Celia's situation all the more horrifying was the legal framework that protected property rights. Under Missouri law, slaves were considered property with no legal right to file a complaint or seek protection from violence. An enslaved woman could not sue a white man for rape, a concept that was considered legally impossible since property could not withdraw consent from its owner. This legal reality created the perfect storm of vulnerability which Robert Newsom exploited with increasing recklessness. Neighbors later recalled seeing him taking Celia around town several times as if to show off his best property. At the store, witnesses saw him buying fabric for dresses that were more beautiful than any slave garment, along with small items like ribbons and soap, signs of a relationship that went far beyond the typical master-slave relationship. The psychological effects of this prolonged abuse quickly became apparent, even though the other slaves were unable to intervene. Coffee. A woman who worked in the Newsom household later testified that Celia would withdraw and appear fearful, especially when Newsom's daughter was away visiting relatives. During these times, Coffee said the house felt as if death had descended upon it. Perhaps the most frightening thing about Robert Newsom's behavior was his twisted belief that his actions were not only legal, but also righteous. His daughter later testified that he often spoke of his responsibilities as a slave owner, that he was taking better care of his slaves than many other owners in the county. This twisted logic allowed him to justify his systematic coercion as care providing shelter, food, and even amenities that Celia would never have enjoyed. But by the end of 1854, a fundamental change began to occur in Celia. Many witnesses later testified that she seemed to be gathering courage, speaking more directly to other slaves and asking questions about the law that none of them were allowed to understand. Coffee clearly remembered one conversation when Celia asked, "If the law does not protect me, can a man be responsible for protecting himself?" These questions were not idle curiosity. By the time 1854 ended, Celia was pregnant with her third child, and according to later testimony, she had reached a tipping point, transforming herself from victim to perpetrator of one of the most horrific crimes in Missouri history. The winter of 1854 brought an unrelenting cold to Callaway County. Temperatures plunged below zero for weeks, and snow piled so high that many farms were completely cut off from their neighbors. This bitter weather created the perfect cover for what was about to unfold on New Year's night, providing concealment, both for the crime itself and the desperate attempts to hide its aftermath. During these months, Celia's behavior began to shift in ways that did not go unnoticed by the other people living on the Newsom farm. Ben later testified that she started asking strange, probing questions: how fire spread, how quickly materials burned, whether buildings could collapse under heat, and what happened to bones exposed to extreme temperatures. At first, he assumed her curiosity stemmed from her responsibilities for maintaining the household fires during the harsh winter. Even more unsettling, Coffey reported that Celia had begun collecting small objects around the farm, pieces of rope metal implements and what appeared to be flammable materials like dried hay and pine pitch. When questioned about these items, Celia claimed she was preparing for emergencies in case the family became snowed in without supplies. Given the severity of the winter, her explanation seemed plausible enough that no one pressed for more details. What we now know, thanks to evidence uncovered during the later trial, is that Celia had spent months crafting a plan as methodical as it was desperate. Court records suggest she had somehow gained access to legal texts, possibly from Newsom's own library, and began to grasp the hopelessness of her situation under Missouri law. If she could not seek protection from her master's abuse, she would have to create her own form of justice. The catalyst for her final decision came in late December, when Newsom announced that his daughters would spend the new year with relatives in Jefferson City, leaving the farm entirely under his control for nearly a week. For Celia, now visibly pregnant with her third child, this news carried terrifying implications. Her experience had taught her that the daughter's absence always meant intensified abuse, as Newsom felt free to act without even the minimal constraint of having his adult children nearby. On December 30th, 1854, Celia made what would later be described as her first direct attempt at resistance. According to her testimony, she approached Newsom in the kitchen while Coffey worked nearby and explicitly asked him to stop his nocturnal visits, citing her pregnancy and failing health. This simple act represented a profound break from the established power dynamics of the farm. Newsom's response was swift and brutal. Coffey later testified that she heard raised voices followed by the sounds of a struggle. When she entered the kitchen, she found Celia on the floor, bleeding from her lip, with Newsom standing over her, his face red with fury. "You don't make demands in my house," Coffey recalled him saying. "You'll do as you're told, or you'll learn what real punishment looks like." That evening, as the temperature plummeted towards zero, Newsom followed through on his threat. Celia later testified that he summoned her to his bedroom with unprecedented violence, making it clear that her pregnancy would not protect her. The assault that followed, by her account, was the most brutal she had endured in 5 years of systematic abuse. But something had changed in Celia during those long, cold months. Instead of succumbing to despair, she made a decision that would alter the course of her life and eventually spark one of the most controversial legal cases in American history. On the evening of December 31st, 1854, as Robert Newsom prepared for what he assumed would be another night of unchallenged domination, Celia was making her final preparations for an act of resistance, an act that would send shockwaves through Missouri's legal system. The bitter wind howled through the bare trees surrounding the Newsom farm, pressing down on the small cluster of buildings like a physical weight, perfectly mirroring the tension that had been building inside Celia for years. The temperature had plunged to nearly 20 degrees below zero frost, thickening over the windows of the main house, obscuring any view of the outside world. For Celia, who had spent weeks meticulously planning this extreme cold, offered both cover and opportunity for the act she was about to undertake. During the day, Robert Newsom followed his usual routine, tending to livestock and checking his stored tobacco crop, but his mood was notably agitated. Ben later testified that the master had been drinking more than usual, not enough to incapacitate him, but enough to make his temper even more unpredictable. Coffee observed him constantly checking the road for signs that his daughters might return early from Jefferson City, though the heavy snow made travel nearly impossible. As evening approached, Newsom's attention increasingly focused on Celia, who moved through her household duties with an airy calm. What he failed to notice, and what Coffee would later recall with chilling clarity, was that Celia had spent the afternoon making subtle preparations throughout the house and barn. She repositioned firewood near the main hearth, adjusted the placement of oil lamps, and made multiple trips to the barn, carrying items she claimed were for livestock care. At around 8 p.m., Newsom dismissed the other enslaved people to their quarters, a routine repeated countless times over the past 5 years. Ben Coffee Party and young Joe huddled around a small fire in the cabin, trying to ignore what they knew was about to unfold in the main house. The thick log walls and the howling wind usually muffled the sounds of Nuome's bedroom, creating a conspiracy of silence that had allowed his crimes to continue unchecked. But that night would be different. Coffee later testified that the sounds from the main house were unusual and alarming. Instead of the muffled voices and rhythmic noises typical of these encounters, there were long stretches of silence interrupted by the sounds of furniture shifting, and at one point, what might have been the crash of breaking crockery by approximately 10:00 p.m. Coffee heard Newsom's voice, raised not in anger but in what sounded like genuine surprise, a tone she had never heard before. Then came nearly an hour of silence, stretching long enough for her to fear that something had gone terribly wrong. The absence of sound was more unsettling than the usual noises of abuse, hinting that the events in the main house had departed from the horrific routine. Our knowledge of what happened inside the Newsom house comes primarily from Celia's own testimony, delivered months later in a packed Callaway County courtroom. According to her account, Newsom summoned her to his bedroom as expected, but she had come prepared for defiance instead of submission. I told him I couldn't bear it anymore. Celia testified, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. I said the baby I was carrying might not survive if he kept forcing himself on me. I begged him to wait until after the birth to show some Christian mercy. Nuom's response, according to Celia, was swift and violent. He struck her across the face, knocking her to the floor. But instead of the compliance he expected, he faced something he had never encountered before: open resistance. I got back up, Celia continued. I looked him in the eye and told him that if he touched me again, I would defend myself. I said I didn't care what the law allowed him to do. There had to be some limit to what one human being could endure from another. What happened next would become the central focus of one of Missouri's most controversial trials. Nuome, enraged by her defiance, grabbed her by the throat, choking her while threatening to kill her, and claimed she had died from pregnancy complications. But Celia had anticipated this possibility. During her months of planning, she had concealed a heavy iron poker near the bedroom fireplace, positioning it within reach for exactly this desperate moment. As Nome's hands tightened and her vision began to dim, she managed to grasp the poker and strike him across the temple, knocking him unconscious. The sound of Robert Newsom's body hitting the floor, Celia later testified, was unlike anything she had ever heard, a terrifying mixture of impact and the sudden absence of the heavy breathing and muttered threats that had haunted her for 5 years. For several long minutes, she stood over his motionless form, waiting, uncertain, to see if he would regain consciousness and resume his attack. When it became clear that Newsom was dead, his skull fractured from the blow-eyes, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, Celia faced a new and equally terrifying reality. She had killed a white man in Missouri, a crime that under any circumstances could have led to her immediate execution. Even if she could prove self-defense, the law offered no protection for an enslaved person who killed their master. Yet, instead of panic, Celia's desperate intelligence took over. Rather than fleeing a futile choice in the middle of a brutal Missouri winter, she methodically executed a plan she had been developing for weeks. The next phase required a level of physical and emotional strength that seems almost superhuman. She was 6 months pregnant, injured from the struggle, and working alone in sub-zero temperatures. The first task was to move Newsom's body from the bedroom to a place where it could be completely destroyed. Alone and heavily pregnant, she used bed sheets and rope she had strategically positioned earlier that evening, wrapping his corpse and dragging it down the stairs and toward the barn. The barn itself had been prepared meticulously. Celia had spent her afternoon arranging hay and firewood to create what she would later describe as a controlled blaze, though she never used the term in her testimony. She gathered combustible materials, pine pitch dried corn stalks, and even some of the fine fabric Newsom had purchased for her dresses. Everything that would burn hot and fast enough to destroy evidence completely. Coffey's testimony provides the only eyewitness account of the next few hours, though her view was limited to what she could see from the slave quarters. She recalled unusual flickering lights in the barn sometime after midnight, far brighter than a single lantern could produce. And then, around 2 a.m., a smell began drifting across the farm. Not just wood smoke, but something organic, sweet, and sickening, unlike anything she had encountered before. The fire. Celia said burned with an intensity visible even through the thick frost covering the slave quarters windows. But this was no accidental blaze. Every aspect was controlled, designed to consume specific materials while leaving the barn structure intact enough to suggest an ordinary accident. The precision suggests Celia had studied the science of combustion, possibly in the same books that had taught her Missouri's legal statutes. By dawn on January the 1st, 1855, the fire had burned itself out. The barn was gutted, charred timbers, and ash covered what had once been feed and equipment. To a casual observer, it could have looked like an accident, perhaps a lantern tip or a stray spark. But everything about it was intentional. Celia's plan went further than just destroying evidence. She needed a plausible explanation for Newsom's absence. When the other enslaved people emerged from their quarters that New Year's morning, they found her calmly preparing breakfast as if nothing had changed. When Ben asked about their master, Celia explained with remarkable composure that he had gone to town early to conduct business, despite the severe weather and holiday. In that moment, Celia had transformed from victim into the architect of her own survival. executing a plan as calculated as it was, desperate one that would leave Missouri grappling with questions of law, morality, and justice for decades to come. Celia's explanation might have held for a few hours, but it quickly became impossible to sustain as neighbors began noticing signs that something was very wrong. The first to arrive was Thomas Schultman, a neighboring farmer who had planned to discuss a land transaction with Newsom on New Year's Day. Finding no one in the main house except Celia, who insisted her master was away on business, Schultman grew suspicious enough to examine the burned barn and question the other enslaved people. Ben's testimony later revealed the exact moment Celia's carefully constructed story began to unravel. Under Schultman's intense questioning, Ben admitted that he had not actually seen Newsom leave the farm. Even more incriminating, the master's horse was still in its stall, and Newsom's heavy winter coat remained hanging on its hook, hardly the attire for a business trip in sub-zero temperatures. As more neighbors arrived throughout the day, drawn by news of the mysterious fire and their friend's unexplained absence, Celia faced increasingly hostile interrogation. The white farmers of Callaway County were not easily fooled. They began piecing together a timeline that made Celia's story untenable. The breakthrough came when Schultman and two other men decided to search the barn ruins more thoroughly. Hidden among the ash and debris, they found objects no accidental fire should have produced: fragments of human bone teeth and Robert Newsom's gold pocket watch. Its face cracked, but the engraved initials still legible. The horror in Callaway County only intensified from there. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with physical evidence of her master's death and unable to maintain her fiction, Celia made a choice that would transform her from a cunning survivor into a woman willing to tell the truth about the horrors of slavery. The moment of truth came around 4:00 p.m. on January the 2nd, 1855, as shadows stretched across the ash-covered floor of the Newsom barn. Thomas Schultman held up the charred remains of Newsom's pocket watch, a blackened gold case, still bearing the engraved initials R.N. Faithful Service to God and Country. The other men, farmers, businessmen, pillars of Callaway County society, stood in silent shock around the grim evidence. Celia, brought under guard to the barn, showed none of the hysteria or collapse the men expected from a woman in her situation. According to multiple witnesses, she displayed a chilling calm, as if she had been preparing for this moment for years. When confronted directly, she made a choice that stunned everyone present. "Yes, I killed Robert Newsom," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I killed him because he had been raping me for 5 years since I was 14. I killed him because he said he would continue until the day I died, and that my children would suffer the same fate. I killed him because the law gave me no other choice." The silence that followed was profound. Here was an enslaved woman, not only admitting to killing her master, but doing so in words that challenged the very foundations of Missouri society. By using the word rape to describe her master's actions, Celia was asserting that an enslaved person could withdraw consent, a concept Missouri law specifically denied. Thomas Schultman, who would later testify at her trial, recalled that his first instinct was to strike her for insolence. But something in her demeanor stopped him. This was not the behavior of a woman begging for forgiveness or claiming temporary insanity. This was a woman telling the unvarnished truth, a truth that would resonate through Missouri's courts for months to come. Celia was no longer just a terrified girl trapped in a nightmare. She was a calculated actor, fully aware of the consequences she faced. Those who witnessed her that day described it in almost reverent terms. Thomas Schultman testified that she looked at them as if they were the criminals, not her. She looked like the judge, and we were the ones on trial, he recalled. Her testimony to the court would later stun everyone in Callaway County. She spoke with devastating precision, recounting not only the systematic sexual abuse that had produced 2 children, but also the psychological torture Robert Newsom had inflicted to ensure her silence. She told of threats against other enslaved people, punishments that extended to anyone who showed her kindness, and a system designed to make resistance impossible. Even more horrifying was the clinical detail with which Celia described the murder itself. She explained how she had studied Newsom's routines for months, learning when he was most vulnerable and how to position herself for maximum effect. She described the construction of the barn fire, the temperature required to completely consume human remains, and the careful arrangement of evidence to make it appear accidental. I spent every night for 4 months planning how to kill him, she told the court. I studied his books to learn about lore about fire, about what it would take to make him disappear completely. I wanted him to burn the way he made me burn inside. Celia's intimate knowledge of Newsom's habits made her testimony even more chilling, from the location of his scars to his most private routines, conversations, and mannerisms. She recounted how he forced her to call him master, even during assaults, how he quoted scripture while committing crimes, and how he had begun planning to abuse her infant daughter once the child was old enough. But the most shocking aspect of her confession wasn't just the crime she described. It was her legal reasoning, which directly challenged Missouri's slave codes. If I am property, she said, then I cannot be held responsible for crimes against my owner, because property cannot commit crimes. But if I can be held responsible for murder, then I must be a person with the right to defend myself. You cannot have it both ways. This logic was dangerous to the established order. Several men present reportedly urged immediate lynching rather than allowing her arguments to reach a courtroom. The idea that an enslaved person could use legal reasoning to challenge slavery was more threatening than violence itself. It suggested the foundations of Missouri society were built on contradictions that could not survive scrutiny. Celia then revealed a network of people who had assisted her. Free blacks in Jefferson City had smuggled legal documents, a sympathetic clerk had allowed access to law books, and shockingly, several prominent white citizens had knowingly ignored Newsom's crimes. Judge Marshall knew, she said. He saw the bruises on my arms. Reverend Hammond knew. He saw my children and couldn't help but notice who they resembled. Dr. Breenidge knew when he treated my broken ribs last spring. They all knew, and they all decided Robert Newsom's reputation mattered more than my suffering. Despite calls for extrajudicial justice, Judge William Hall, a Virginia-born jurist with deep roots in Missouri's slaveholding society, decided to allow a legal trial. He recognized that Celia's case raised questions the law could no longer ignore, and it was better to confront them in a controlled courtroom than let them fester in the community. Yet, as preparations for the trial began, an even deeper layer of the story emerged. Investigators discovered books, newspapers, and legal documents hidden in the slave quarters, materials no enslaved person should have possessed. They also found detailed journals in Celia's handwriting, chronicling not only her own abuse, but that of other enslaved women throughout Callaway County, including names, dates, and incidents that suggested systematic sexual violence across the region. The journals implicated prominent families, raising the possibility that Celia's case could reveal a web of crimes the community had worked for decades to conceal. Questions now loomed larger than the murder itself. How had Celia learned to read complex legal arguments? Who had helped her? How extensive was this network of support, and how many other enslaved people might be receiving similar education and courage? As Celia was transported to the Callaway County Jail to await trial, these questions hung over the community like smoke from the burned barn. The physical crime had been solved, but the intellectual and moral challenges it posed were only just beginning. The trial of Celia began on October 9, 1855, in a Callaway County courthouse packed to overflowing. Spectators had traveled from across Missouri to witness what newspapers described as the most significant legal proceeding in the state's history. The case had already ignited fierce debate. Northern abolitionist papers hailed Celia as a symbol of courage and resistance, while Southern pro-slavery publications denounced the trial as a dangerous precedent that could threaten the entire institution of slavery. Presiding over the case, Judge William Hall faced legal questions that had never before been directly addressed by Missouri courts. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their master? Did the state's laws protecting women from sexual assault extend to enslaved women? And perhaps most fundamentally, could property commit crimes against its owner or claim protection under the law? Celia's defense team, led by John Jameson, a respected attorney who had taken the case pro bono, despite intense social pressure, built their arguments around Missouri's existing statutes protecting women from sexual assault. They argued that the laws made no explicit racial distinctions and therefore should apply to all women within the state. If Celia had the legal right to resist rape, then the killing of Robert Newsom constituted justifiable homicide. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Puite, countered with the unyielding logic of Missouri's slave code. Enslaved people were property, not persons under the law. As property, Celia could not withdraw consent from her master's actions, making the very concept of rape legally impossible. Allowing an enslaved woman to claim self-defense against her master, they argued, would undermine the foundation of slavery, leaving masters vulnerable to violence whenever their authority was challenged. The testimony that emerged during the trial painted a horrifying picture of life under slavery, a reality many white Missourians had never directly confronted. Coffee Ben and other witnesses recounted in painstaking detail the systematic sexual abuse Celia had endured, describing acts so violent they shocked even hardened observers. Even more remarkable was the revelation of a network of support that had enabled her resistance, a loose alliance of enslaved people, free blacks and sympathetic whites who had supplied her with books, legal knowledge, and emotional support. This network proved far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Testimony revealed that Celia had been in contact with members of the Underground Railroad, though she never attempted escape. Instead, She used these connections to gain access to legal texts and understand Missouri law. Her decision to resist through calculated violence rather than flight was, her attorneys argued, the result of this careful legal education. Even if she had escaped, her children would have remained enslaved, vulnerable to the same horrors she had endured. Perhaps the most damning testimony for the prosecution came from Dr. Marcus Breenidge, the physician who had treated Celia's injuries over the years. Under oath, Breenidge admitted he had documented clear evidence of sexual assault and violent abuse, some incidents dating back to when Celia was only 15 years old. I knew what I was seeing. Breenidge testified, his voice barely audible in the crowded courtroom. But I also knew speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroy my practice and endanger my family. The law provided no protection for an enslaved woman against her master's abuse. Even more shocking was the testimony of Margaret Foster, a free black seamstress from Fulton, who had maintained contact with Celia throughout her ordeal. Foster revealed that for nearly a decade, she had been documenting sexual abuse against enslaved women, creating records implicating dozens of prominent families across central Missouri. Celia wasn't unique, Foster testified. She was just the first brave enough to fight back. Every enslaved woman I knew lived under this terror. Every one of them understood that their bodies belonged to their masters in ways far beyond labor. Foster's testimony opened the door to revelations that would send shockwaves through Missouri society. For the first time, the courtroom and the public was forced to confront the brutal reality of systemic sexual violence, the legal impossibility of defending oneself as an enslaved person, and the moral contradictions that underpinned the institution of slavery itself. The defense presented shocking evidence that Robert Newsom had participated in an informal network of slaveholders who regularly exchanged enslaved women for sexual purposes. Letters discovered among Newsom's belongings described arrangements with neighboring farmers to borrow enslaved women for extended periods, often while their own wives were away visiting relatives. The prosecution's attempt to argue that Celia's actions were motivated by jealousy backfired spectacularly. By implying any sort of romantic or sexual involvement, they acknowledged the very abuse they claimed was legally impossible, undermining their core argument that enslaved people could not be victims of sexual crimes. As the trial unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this case had grown far beyond a single act of murder. Newspaper correspondents from New York, Charleston, and beyond packed the courthouse, turning Celia's story into a national sensation. Prominent abolitionists organized rallies demanding her freedom, while pro-slavery politicians decried the proceedings as an attack on Southern institutions. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days, an unusually long period reflecting the unprecedented complexity of the case. When they finally returned on October 19, 1855, the tension in the packed courtroom was palpable. Every person present understood that the verdict would have consequences far beyond Celia's individual fate. The foreman, Thomas Westbrook, a farmer and Methodist lay preacher, stepped forward, his voice shaking as he delivered the words that would echo through history. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, but we recommend mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case." Under Missouri law, the guilty verdict was legally inevitable. Yet, the jury's recommendation for mercy was unprecedented. Their written statement explained that while Celia's actions were technically criminal, the moral culpability lay with a system that offered her no other choice. They called upon the governor to commute her sentence and urged the legislature to address the legal contradictions that had made their verdict necessary. When Judge William Hall pronounced the sentence, he delivered what many historians consider one of the most remarkable judicial statements in American history. Bound by law to impose death, he did not shy away from condemning the system that had created Celia's desperate circumstances. This court has been compelled to apply laws that reduce human beings to property while simultaneously holding them accountable as persons when they resist their dehumanization. This contradiction lies at the heart of our legal system and will, I predict, ultimately destroy the institution of slavery itself. Celia killed her master, and under our laws, she must die for that crime. But history will judge that the greater crime was the system that gave her no other choice. Celia's execution was scheduled for December 21st, 1855, but she would never face the gallows. On November 23rd, aided by unknown accomplices, she escaped from the Callaway County Jail. Despite extensive searches and substantial rewards for her capture, she was never found. Rumors persisted for decades. Some claimed she had been spirited north by Underground Railroad operatives, others that she had perished attempting to cross the icy Missouri River. The truth of her fate remains one of American history's enduring mysteries. What is undeniable is the impact of her case. Celia's trial fundamentally altered the legal and moral conversation in Missouri. Abolitionist groups widely distributed trial transcripts, and her story became a symbol of resistance, inspiring other enslaved people across the South. Several prominent families implicated by Foster's testimony faced social ostracism and economic boycott, some forced to leave Callaway County. Dr. Breenidge's medical practice collapsed after his testimony, though he later became an active abolitionist, helping train physicians to care for formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. Perhaps most importantly, the legal arguments developed during Celia's defense echoed far beyond Missouri. Judge Hall's identification of the contradiction, treating enslaved people as property while holding them criminally accountable as persons, became a central theme in abolitionist literature and legal challenges to slavery throughout the 1850s. The Newsom farm itself was abandoned. The burned barn was never rebuilt, and locals reported that the property remained haunted by the memory of what had occurred there. By 1860, the land had returned to wilderness, with only the stone foundation of the main house marking where one woman's desperate act of resistance had challenged the foundations of American society. Celia's story reminds us that even within the most oppressive systems, human dignity finds ways to assert itself, often at a terrible cost. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history while recognizing the extraordinary courage of those who resisted injustice when the law offered no protection. What do you think of this story? Were Celia's actions justified given the circumstances she faced? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this tale compelling and want to explore more hidden chapters of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex realities of our past. These stories need to be told, and together we can ensure they are never forgotten. In the next video, we'll uncover another chapter of history that someone tried to bury.